Hello everyone. As mentioned in Mannequin of the Month, I've recently dug out a collection of British issue tropical hats, and what we're going to have a look at here is a progression from the introduction of these towards the end of the Second World War. 1945 is the earliest date we're going to look at, and then we'll have a look at the changes to the design over time, basically through the end of the Cold War into the early 1990s. So that's what we're going to have a look at in some detail now. So hats. We have quite a few hats to look at here, as you can see. They're not particularly well displayed here. They're a little bit difficult to display altogether in shot, but just to give you an overview, obviously we're moving from initial issue over here through to the Gulf War at this end. So basically the span of the Cold War effectively, and the development of the British hot weather hat. So we'll start having a look at these individually and talk a little bit about the evolution of this design. So the first hat we're going to look at here is dated 1945, as we'll see in a minute. As is typical of quite a lot of these that have appeared on the market, this has been slashed. The crown at the top here has been slashed and then stitched up and repaired. But it is an early example of one of these hot weather or jungle hats. As you can see, it displays all the features which are typical of this and then the later designs. You have the stitched brim, as you can see. We have a seam at the side here and a seam at the other side there. Foliage loops run all the way around here, and then the rear here there's a seam all the way down, and then there is at the front as well in this instance. And we have the mesh ventilation eyelets in the side here, which are fairly typical of most of these hats. There are some variations, we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this sequence. And the construction is very simple, as you can see. If we turn this inside out here, we can see, just remember where the marking is, here we are, it's on the other side. Nice big clear stamp here with the manufacturer and a very clear date of 1945, as you can see. So this example is made in the SCC 19 green colour. It's a slightly darker, almost forest green compared to the slightly later, I think SCC 17, if I remember correctly, the standard camouflage colours that the British Army used at the time. So the shade of green used changed slightly over time, or basically was specified to be different compared to the early post-war jungle uniform, which is colloquially referred to as 1947 pattern, which uses drill material, similar colour to this, and obviously the drill version of the late war jungle uniform also used this sort of colour, and then the 1950 pattern trousers made in drill used the lighter shade of green. So just something to note here, and the hat would change colour as well over time. As we'll see, this would remain in production basically as you see it here in terms of the overall design for 20 years, and we'll see an example from the 1960s in just a minute. The next one to have a look at is made in KD. So the next hat to look at here is basically the design we've already looked at, dating back to 1945, but now made in khaki for use in arid hot weather environments as opposed to jungle. And this, I believe, was introduced alongside the 1950 pattern uniform in khaki. So the 1950 pattern uniform was of course made in both khaki and green. There were two versions of it, obviously khaki for use in arid environments and the green for use in jungle environments. And it's my understanding that that's when the design of hat we see here was introduced, is a desert version, an arid version of the hot weather hat made in khaki, as you can see. Otherwise the design is basically the same as that we've just looked at. You can see all the features are here, the mesh ventilation eyelets, foliage loops even, of course, and the stitch brim and so forth. Interestingly, this does have a maker's stamp in it, which we can see here. Quite a small size, but it's been stretched, so I can wear this, but it was originally a 6.5, stretched by the seller, and they do now fit about a 7 1/8, which is quite a sizing up, but it did work. You can see the manufacturer there, and the date stamp 1954, hopefully that's clear enough, but this interestingly has a War Department inspection stamp with the letter O, which I believe is 1955. I think there were several letters used in 1955, and O is one of them. See that in the crown there, inside the crown of this. So that's a mid-50s example of the khaki version of this hot weather hat. We'll move on now to have a look at another jungle example. So we have the later example of the jungle hat at the bottom here. At the top we have the 1945 dated example, just to give you an example of that change in colour. So the 1945 example, say a bit faded, but made originally in a darker green colour, and you can see this is a lighter and slightly more vibrant green. We'll move the 1945 dated hat out of the way now and focus on this example. It's exactly per those we've looked at already, The features are all there, the stitched brim, etc., etc. We look inside, we have the date stamp, the manufacturer here, and this is a nice clear manufacturer stamp in there, and it's dated 1966. So we've had 20 years go by, and other than a slight change in colour, the design hasn't changed. You can see detail of the specific ventilation eyelets here, the way they are sort of formed and basically riveted into position. But just interesting to note that the design up to this point hasn't really changed, and we're into the mid-1960s at this point. We'll bring in a slightly later example again to show one of the small changes that was introduced to the design. So what we have here is basically indistinguishable externally from those green hats we've already looked at, but it does have a detail difference inside, and that's the addition of these two little tabs with what would originally have been stitched eyelets in them. And this of course allows for a chin cord to be attached, and this was a modification to the design. This particular example has a late 60s or early 70s contract number in it. You can see the A78 contract number here. It's possibly a date, oh no, it's not a date, sorry, there is a number at the top here. I'm not entirely sure what that is. The contract numbers here, and obviously we have the manufacturer here, which I think is V and E Limited, and this is a size 7 1/8. Quite a nice example. Don't know quite what the number pertains to at the top. It's possible it's a NATO stock number, but it's not clear. That might be a 99 in the middle, I'm not sure, or certainly a stores code or something of that nature. But anyway, we have the contract number at the bottom there, and this slight modification to the design to have these two little tabs, say to allow for a chin cord to be attached, and that's something that will be taken forward in the design going forward. So that's a late production example, mid-late 60s, very early 70s, somewhere around there, presumably after the 1966 dated example we've looked at, which didn't have those little tabs. Presumably it was a late 60s development or a very early 70s development with these. And then of course in the 1970s you'd have the change over to the next type we're going to look at, which is manufactured in DPM, and we're going to have a look at an example of one of those now. So in the 1970s, there was a move away from jungle green clothing, which of course had been introduced during the Second World War, and there was a move to introduce camouflage clothing for tropical environments. And you can see that here with the hot weather hat, the tropical hat made in a very bright version of DPM, which was typical of the 1970s tropical combat uniform. And this is made of a slightly lighter weight polycotton drill, as opposed to the cotton drill we've looked at previously. Interestingly, there are there's slightly different versions of DPM used in this. You can see here there are a slight difference in colour between the crown and then the side of the hat here and the foliage loops. So the crown and the foliage loops are made of the same sort of DPM, and there's a slightly different print on the side of the hat here, and similarly the brim has a slightly different print as well. So this has been made up from pieces of DPM from different bolts of cloth, interestingly. Really quite a nice example from that point of view. But this is typical of the mid-1970s when the tropical combat uniform was introduced. Through the late 1970s, you still see a lot of these bright DPM hats being made. And this retains the chin cord tabs there. They're slightly larger and they now have metal eyelets, as you can see. The stitched eyelets wore through, as was shown on the previous example we looked at. So metal eyelets have been inserted there. This has quite a long and thick nylon cord, well, two sections. It's not one loop, two sections, each one knotted into each side, and then you have a little toggle there to tighten that up as required. Inside we do have a label, which is unfortunately rather washed out, but you can see that there. Hopefully, there we go, if I don't get too much of a glare off there, you can see the details. We have the NATO stock number, sizing, etc. on there, contract number and the manufacturer, of course. So you can see that there. Held up surprisingly well, actually. It's a bit faded. And then we have a care instructions label here as well, which is quite badly folded up, but you can see there, gives you the details, even telling you to warm iron if you were required to iron your tropical hat there. So that is an example of one of these from the 1970s, possibly early 80s, but around that time frame, made in this bright tropical DPM, which was typical of the tropical uniform, the tropical DPM combat uniform of the time. So as time went on, the hat continued to be manufactured, and there was a change to the cloth. During the 1980s, the print generally became darker. Still made in the same sort of weight of polycotton, but the print, as we can see here, is darker. The brown and the black are noticeably darker, as is the green and the tan really as well. So that's a change that occurred. It doesn't change the overall design, but the print of the cloth has changed somewhat. As we can see inside, you have the tabs there. These have slightly more substantial eyelets for the cord, for the chin cord there. We do have a label here which gives the sizing of 58. Someone's written £1 on this at some point. There's not a huge amount more detail to see on the label there. This does have a paper tag for RAF Cottesmore through the label and through the side of the hat with one of these little plastic tags here, which are typical of sort of clothing labels. You can see that there. But otherwise the design, again, basically the same as we saw in the hat made in 1945, but manufactured in the polycotton. And obviously the main difference is the cord, the eyelets for the cord here, and the fact it's actually made in camouflage cloth. But even at this late stage of the Cold War, the basic design remains the same. We then move to Desert DPM, and of course in the Gulf War there was a need for a hat made in the new Desert DPM print, the two-colour print in which the tropical combat uniform for issue in the Gulf was being manufactured, and we have an example of one of those hats here. As you can see, the design is per the sort of brown, green, black, tan DPM we've looked at. The actual design of the hat is exactly the same, but manufactured in the Desert DPM cloth, the two-colour Desert DPM cloth. You can see the label here with, again, size 58, the contract number there, SL33B 5428, and the NATO stock number at the top there. Obviously we do have a name written across there, but you can make out the label fairly well there within the hat. The design, as I say, otherwise exactly the same design of eyelets. You've got the tabs there for the chin cord, and overall the design hasn't really changed at all. As I say, you've got the same manner of construction essentially. The side seams there in the brim, and then the front and back seams there, as you can see. Or in this instance, I think there is one seam, slight manufacturing difference from what we saw earlier. The one seam at the back there, and then no seam at the front, as you can see there. So a slight variation. And there's one more variation to look at, which is another example of one of these that has a slight variation in terms of manufacturing, which we'll look at now. So this is the final hat we're going to look at here, another example of the Desert DPM hat. This one is simplified somewhat in having simpler version of eyelets used for ventilation in the crown, as you can see here in the sides of the hat rather. These are simply tan painted metal eyelets. You don't have the mesh and so forth as we've seen on the previous designs, which simplifies things somewhat. Still made in the two-colour Desert DPM, as you can see there. Inside we have the two little tabs. In this case we have a chin cord. This khaki nylon cord that's just been knotted for use as a chin cord there. You can see inside, there are no markings in this that I've been able to find, but you do have the back side of the eyelets there. And this is also just a variation that you see in use during the Gulf War. There are further variations of these, but they're sort of outside the area I collect. You see versions with both the mesh eyelets and these small eyelets going forward. Neck curtains were introduced, and you see further variations which are beyond the scope of this video. Stick very much to Cold War collecting as much as I can, and sort of the Gulf is the cut-off period, and the same goes here. That's basically where we'll sort of cut off looking at the development of these. But they have gone forward, obviously, with some modifications to be made in MTP, of course, and there's been a continual evolution of the design with sort of other features introduced and so forth, as mentioned there in brief, but not something we're going to get into here in any detail. That's the final hat we're going to look at. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. I thought it would be interesting to make a video looking at them side by side and sort of talk about the progression, the design changes which occur over time, and how the design is sort of incrementally modified as new features are introduced, and obviously as new forms of cloth, new uniform is introduced more generally, obviously with the introduction of camouflage clothing and so forth. So I do hope it has been interesting. If you have found it interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I always say, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch with me but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.